For a time of confession, I'm going to read from the fourth commandment. We've been reading from the fourth commandment in Exodus. It's slightly different in Deuteronomy, so I'm going to read the Deuteronomy version today. Deuteronomy chapter 5, starting at verse 13. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. We're continuing, obviously, reading the fourth commandment and looking at it in our time of confession. Question 117 of the larger catechism, as Daniel read last week, asks the question, how is the Sabbath or the Lord's day to be sanctified? And the answer is, the Sabbath or Lord's day is to be sanctified by an holy resting all the day, not only from such works as are at all times sinful, but even from such worldly employments and recreations as are on the other days lawful, and making it our delight to spend the whole time, except so much of it as is to be taken up in works of necessity and mercy, in the public and private exercises of God's worship. And to that end, we are to prepare our hearts and with such foresight, diligence, and moderation to dispose and seasonably to dispatch our worldly business, that we may be the more free and fit for the duties of the day. Today, I'd like to focus on the phrase that we just read in the Catechism, the phrase that says, except so much of it as is to be taken up in the works of necessity and mercy. Certainly, as followers of Christ, we should keep the Sabbath day free from our ordinary work and recreation. That is the whole point of the command to rest on the Lord's day and to rest your servants on the Lord's day. But there is work that needs to be done even on the Sabbath day. We are not to interpret it woodenly as the Pharisees did, calculating how many steps could be taken before walking qualified as work. And we know that we're not to do that because Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for it. There are several examples in the Bible of works of necessity and mercy. It is lawful to feed oneself on the Sabbath, and we know that from Mark 2:23 and the following verses. That would extend to feeding your family and feeding your animals, whether pets or livestock. Certainly farmers have their cows to milk on the Sabbath. God has designed the world so that cows keep producing milk even on the Lord's day. Another example, it's lawful to rescue an animal that had fallen in a pit, as Jesus says in Luke 14:5. By extension, it is therefore appropriate for policemen and firemen to work on the Sabbath. Jesus healed, and frequently on the Sabbath. It is therefore not only permissible, but required that physicians and nurses sometimes work on the Sabbath. In a modern society like ours, there are many other implications of this. There are lots of support people involved in keeping police on duty, dispatchers, 911 operators, and so forth. Support people are certainly required in hospitals to keep them open, from ward clerks to janitors. Or when the power goes out, there needs to be workers to restore it. We're all grateful when the electric company comes and restores our power, even if it's on the Sabbath day. And the classic example of a modern industry that cannot shut down on the Sabbath is the steel mill, which reportedly takes 2.5 days to shut down and another 2.5 days to restart. All of this can fall under the heading of works of necessity and mercy. The Westminster Divines, following the Lord Jesus Christ, wisely provided exceptions to the command to rest for the entire Lord's day. But as with everything relating to God's law, there are two extremes even for the exceptions. The first is to interpret it woodenly, as the Pharisees did, and try to calculate exactly what qualifies as acceptable work. Jesus showed that it was acceptable to feed oneself on the Sabbath. Therefore, that means we can feed ourselves, but no one else. So kids, you've got to get your own cereal on the Lord's Day. Or you've got to make your own sandwiches for lunch. Obviously, we couldn't even have fellowship meals if we were to follow this woodenly. We wouldn't be able to work on the Sabbath, so we couldn't even put our food on the tables, according to the Pharisees. In our modern American culture, though, there's very little danger of being too rigorous on the Lord's Day. It is possible, but it's really not very dangerous. Although many of you have grown up in very legalistic homes where it isn't hard to imagine a Pharisaical interpretations of the fourth commandment. Of course, our greater temptation is to go the other way and think that since there are exceptions to the commandment not to work, that means that we can do whatever we want. Meals have to be prepared on the Lord's Day for sure, but that doesn't mean it has to be a lavish 7-course spread. And men, just because your wives are allowed to do their usual work of meal preparation on the Sabbath as a work of necessity, does not mean that they don't need to rest from their work as well as you. So that means help. For farmers, the cows need to be fed and milked on Sunday, but that doesn't mean that the front grass needs to be mowed or the back 40 needs to be plowed. The vegetable garden may need to be watered on the Lord's Day when the temperature is 100 degrees for a week in a row like it is right now, but that doesn't mean it needs to be weeded on the Lord's Day. A man may have to take a job that requires him to work on the Lord's Day, and it is the only work he can find to feed his family. He should take that job to provide for his household, but he can be trying to arrange the schedule with his boss so as not to work on the Sabbath, or he can be looking for another job. Emergency surgery may need to be done on the Lord's Day, but that doesn't mean that routine surgery cannot wait until Monday. A few weeks ago, I used the example of needing gas to get home from church, and that is permissible, but it would have been better, and I'm talking to myself here, it would have been better had I gotten gas the night before. The principle is to be biblically wise, to be obeying the 2 great commandments, to be following Jesus' examples in the scriptures. Do the things that have to be done, regardless of the day, and do them to the best of your ability. But don't do the things that can be done and should be done on the other 6 days of the week. This reminds us of our sin, our tendency to address God's commandments in a wooden way like the Pharisees, and our tendency to be antinomian and think that the commandments can be ignored. We need to confess our sin, this sin and all the other sin that we've committed, before a holy God in order to worship in his presence. I therefore invite you to kneel with me, confessing your own sin privately and then corporately as printed in the bulletin.